The lantern had become my nightly companion, a flickering, warm glow that barely cut through the thick fog that often clung to the streets of Dunsley like a damp shroud. The town, nestled between forested hills and an ancient, slow-moving river, had a reputation for being quiet, almost too quiet. That suited me just fine. I liked my walks in the stillness, the only sound being the gentle clink of the lantern handle against its metal frame as it swung in my hand. I'd been taking these walks for years now, ever since I moved to this small town. No cars honked, no people crowded the sidewalks, and most of the houses stayed dark as their inhabitants settled into bed by 9 p.m. But for me this was the hour I came alive. The lantern was a tradition from my grandfather, who used it during his time as a night watchman back in his village. It made me feel connected to him even though he was long gone. Tonight, though, something was different. I had chosen a path I rarely ventured down, a narrow trail that led through Harton Park. The park wasn't much to look at, just a few benches and a scattering of old oak trees, but in the night, it transformed into something darker, something that felt far older than the town itself. The trees loomed over the path, their branches tangling together like twisted fingers, blotting out what little moonlight there was. My lantern's glow became more important than ever as the path turned almost pitch black. I pressed on, enjoying the cool air on my face, the feeling of solitude, until the first crackling sound. It was subtle, the kind of noise you might write off as a branch snapping underfoot, but something in my gut churned. I stopped and turned slowly, the lantern casting elongated shadows over the thick trees and brush. Nothing but darkness and the sigh of wind through the leaves. I continued walking, quicker this time. My boots hit the gravel path with more force than usual, my breath puffing out in small visible clouds as I clutched the lantern tighter. The sense of peace that had always accompanied me on these walks was gone now, replaced by an eerie awareness of every sound. A squirrel darting between trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and then that sound again, a crunch, a rustle just behind me. I stopped. This time the sound didn't vanish into the night like before. It lingered, creeping up on me like the cold air that began to seep through my coat. I turned sharply, holding up the lantern higher, letting its light stretch further into the park's inky blackness. Nothing. The path behind me was empty. Just the endless rows of trees swaying slightly in the breeze. But then why did my skin crawl? Why did I feel that unmistakable prickling at the back of my neck, like eyes, cold, unseen eyes, were fixed on me? I swallowed hard and told myself to keep walking. Harton Park wasn't large. It would only take a few more minutes to get through. The faster I moved, the sooner I could leave this place and return to the safety of home. The houses that lined the park seemed so far away now, their darkened windows like dead eyes staring blankly into the night. I picked up the pace, my legs stiffening with the cold and the growing sense of urgency. But with every step that noise followed me, slight at first, a whisper on the wind, then louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, matching my every movement. I couldn't take it anymore. Whirling around, I thrust the lantern into the darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cutting through the stillness. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in the quiet of the park. But no answer came, only the rustling of leaves. I stood there, breathless, staring into the void between the trees. The lantern light swayed, casting jagged shadows that danced and flickered, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. I didn't want to move, couldn't move, but I knew I had to. Standing still felt more dangerous than anything else at that moment. Just as I lowered the lantern and took a hesitant step forward, something changed. The air around me grew colder, the silence thicker, suffocating. I felt a presence. Not just the sensation of being watched, but something closer, something real. The footsteps had stopped, no longer behind me but beside me, right next to me. I swung the lantern to my left, my pulse racing. And in the faint, flickering light I saw something, or thought I saw something. A shape, darker than the night itself, blending into the shadows of the trees. It wasn't human. It was taller, its form barely discernible, like smoke caught in the light for just a moment before it vanished. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribcage. Was it my imagination? Had I been alone for too long, losing myself in the isolation of these walks? The rational part of my brain begged me to turn around and run, but my legs felt glued to the spot. Whatever it was, it hadn't moved, at least not yet. But it was there, and it was watching. I forced my feet to move, but each step felt like I was dragging the weight of dread behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, those cold, piercing eyes that seemed to lurk just beyond the reach of my lantern's light. My breath was shallow now, puffing out in frantic clouds that swirled and disappeared into the night air. The trees seemed closer than before, leaning in toward the narrow path, branches overhead tangled like a net waiting to fall. The footsteps were gone, but the silence they left was worse. Every creak, every snap of a twig sounded louder, unnatural in the stillness. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, that Harton Park, with its ancient trees and suffocating darkness, was playing tricks on me. But that shape I'd seen, the formless thing that had stood so close, had felt real. And I knew, somehow deep down, that it wasn't alone. My legs moved faster, almost jogging now, but the path seemed to stretch on forever, as if I was running in place, making no progress. The lantern swung wildly in my hand, casting its flickering light in frantic arcs across the path. Shadows danced and jumped along the tree trunks, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, something slipping between the trees ahead. I swallowed the rising panic and told myself to keep going, to keep moving forward. The edge of the park had to be close. I knew it wasn't far, but every step felt like I was pushing deeper into the dark instead of escaping it. The air grew colder, biting through my coat and chilling me to the bone. The night had become too still. No wind, no rustling of leaves. Just my own breath, fast and uneven, and the faint, erratic clink of the lantern handle. And then, just as I was about to break into a full sprint, my lantern flickered. The soft, warm glow that had been my only comfort began to sputter, the flame dancing dangerously close to going out. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the light as it dimmed and brightened, like it was struggling to stay alive. My heart hammered in my chest. I shook the lantern, desperate to keep the light going, but the flame only wavered more. "No, no, no," I muttered under my breath, the words catching in my throat. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, swallowing up the edges of the path as the lantern's light grew weaker. I quickened my pace, my legs trembling beneath me. My hand gripped the lantern's handle so tightly it hurt, but I couldn't let go. The path in front of me was barely visible now, a hazy line of gravel and shadow that seemed to blur into nothingness. I couldn't let the light die. Not here. Not now. Suddenly the lantern went out. The world around me plunged into absolute darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rapid pounding of my own heartbeat. I stood there, paralyzed, my eyes straining to see anything in the black void around me. But there was nothing. Just endless, suffocating darkness. And then a sound. A whisper. Faint. Almost imperceptible. It came from somewhere ahead of me, from the depths of the park. I felt my blood turn to ice as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't words, at least not words I could understand, but the tone, the way it slithered through the silence, filled me with a terror I had never known before. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, and I nearly fell. My hand fumbled for the lantern, shaking it frantically as if the simple act would bring back the flame. After a few desperate moments, the lantern flickered to life again, the weak glow illuminating just enough to see a few feet in front of me. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But then the light hit something. I stopped cold, the hairs on the back of my neck rising as the lantern's weak beam caught the edge of a shape, something pale and hunched just ahead on the path. I blinked, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing, but my body refused to move. My heart thundered in my chest as the shape shifted slightly, slow, deliberate. I took a step closer, the lantern shaking in my trembling hand. The pale figure became clearer now, standing motionless in the center of the path. It was facing away from me, its body draped in what looked like a torn, ragged gown, the fabric fluttering slightly in the non-existent breeze. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Instead, I raised the lantern higher, the dim light creeping up the figure's back. That's when it turned. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the figure began to pivot toward me. My pulse raced, my entire body screaming in terror, but I couldn't move. My eyes locked onto the face, or what was left of it. The figure's head was tilted, its skin pale and translucent, stretched taut over a gaunt, skeletal frame. Its eyes, oh God, those eyes, were hollow, sunken pits of darkness that seemed to devour the lantern's light. Its mouth hung open in a twisted, soundless scream, lips cracked and bloody. I staggered backward, choking on my own breath. The figure didn't move, didn't advance. It just stood there, watching me with those empty, soul-draining eyes. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was locked, my mind caught in a whirlwind of disbelief and terror. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the ghost, because that's what it had to be, vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence and the faint glow of my lantern. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I fled down the path, my legs moving on pure instinct now. My vision blurred as panic gripped me, every dark shape, every shifting shadow feeling like a threat. The park was endless. It had to be endless. No matter how fast I ran, the trees just kept coming, pressing in on me like walls closing in. The lantern flickered again, but I didn't care. I couldn't stop, couldn't look back. Finally, after what felt like hours, I burst out of the trees and onto the main road. The streetlights seemed blindingly bright after the suffocating darkness of the park. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. I turned to look back at the entrance to the park, half expecting to see that figure standing there, waiting for me. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, deserted street. I never walked at night again after that. The lantern gathered dust on my shelf, its warm glow forever tainted by that night. No one believed me when I tried to tell them what I saw. They said it was the fog, my imagination, the isolation of those long, lonely walks. But I knew the truth. I had seen it, felt its presence, and I would never be the same again.